Today we're learning about the three meals of Shabbat, and a little bit about the mitzvot that kind of frame that kind of are the what underpin that why we have three meals of Shabbat, and kind of the details of what goes into those three meals as well. So a little bit about the background. I want to start with the pre-sources source here, a verse from Isaiah. Im tashiv mishabat raglecha asot chafatzecha b'yom kodshi v'karata l'shabat oneg likdosh Hashem michubad v'chibadto me'asot derachecha mimtzo chefetzcha v'daber davar. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, if you call this Sabbath delight, the Lord's holy day honored, and if you honor it and go not by your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains. So the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, created the parameters and concepts that created the spirit and atmosphere of Shabbat. Without their institutions, without what they gave us, if we only had our Shabbat observance based on explicitly what's written in the written Torah, Shabbat would have been kind of sad and joyless in a lot of ways. We would have sat in the dark without hot food. We wouldn't have needed to refrain from certain types of work that maybe wouldn't have made our Shabbos as restful. So from this verse in Isaiah, for example, the sages derived that Shabbat needs to be a day of oneg and kavod, of delight and honor. In the Torah when we read about the candles of Shabbat, we read about Shamor and Zachor. And those are two mitzvot given in the written Torah. We have to observe Shabbat and we have to remember Shabbat. But these ideas of delighting in Shabbat and honoring Shabbat come from this source in Isaiah, among some others, and are very integral to the framework that the rabbis create for our Shabbat observance. So parenthetically, also, I want to say that this verse is also one of the sources for the prohibitions of conducting business, of engaging in weekday actions and weekday kinds of speech as well. It's one of the sources for that. So Shabbat, I mentioned the Shamor and Zachor, and there's other ways in which this double comes into play. Shabbat being a double blessing, a special day. So we talked about oneg and kavod as well. I think that's another pair. There's also 2 lamb offerings on Shabbat, unique from other days of the week when there was a temple. And also we're going to talk about lechem mishnah. So lechem mishnah being the 2 loaves of bread that we have at every Shabbat meal. Another example of this double blessing of Shabbat. And we'll see a little bit about the foundation of that. Okay, so a little bit of background. Let's go dive into source number 1 from the Shulchan Aruch. A person should arise on Friday early to prepare for Shabbat. Even if he has many servants to serve him, he should find something small to do for the honor of Shabbat. We see this with Rav Chisda, who would cut vegetables finely, Rabba and Rav Yosef, who would chop wood, Rabbi Zera, who would light the flame, and Rav Nachman, who would clean the house and replace the weekday cutlery with cutlery designed for Shabbat. We can emulate these people, and one should not say, it is not becoming of me, for this is the honor of Shabbat. Ramah, so the Ashkenazi gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, says, additionally, one should sharpen his knife to ease eating on Erev Shabbat, for this honors the Shabbat and helps him eat. Okay, so there's a couple things here. The idea of hachana, of preparation, a very important mitzvah that actually takes place before Shabbat has even come in, before Shabbat even happens. The fact that you're preparing for Shabbat, that you're both honoring it with your preparation, you're also making it so that it's as joyful and as enjoyable as possible. And so that you won't have any potential issues. There's the technical need as well, but also that you're showing a kind of the spiritual, emotional part of it is showing the way that you're relating to Shabbat, the appreciation you have for it, and the desire you have to make it as special as possible. So kavod Shabbat, honor of Shabbat, is achieved in one way by properly preparing for Shabbat. I think all of that, the preparing for Shabbat out of kavod for Shabbat, leads to oneg Shabbat. Is one of the precursors for the proper oneg Shabbat, the delighting in Shabbat, taking pleasure in Shabbat. Oneg, this idea is unique to Shabbat. On Yom Tov, we have the verse says "V'samachta v'chagecha," that you should be joyful on the holiday. And we have a mitzvah of simcha, of joy, on Yom Tov, but on Shabbat, there's something unique. It's oneg, it's delight, something slightly different, something special for Shabbat. So source number 2 is going to give one of the examples of that. That's very, I think we're transitioning to being directly, explicitly related to our subject for today, the 3 meals. Source number 2 talks about the place of eating and drinking in that. A person should have more meat, wine, and treats to the best of his ability. So as much as within what is within one's means, the food and the drinks and everything that you consume and enjoy on Shabbat should be a level higher than what you have during the week. It's important for it to be uniquely special. So the rabbis understood that delighting in part is referring to food and drink. And in their time, delighting meant meat, wine, fruits, other delicacies. I think not so different from our time, probably a lot of the same things for many of us. But delighting in food and drink on Shabbat is subjective. So whatever foods and drink you most enjoy is the best way to be fulfilling this mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat. So it's something special, something that you really, really appreciate and love, and makes you have that fondness for Shabbat and reverence for the day itself by elevating the level, having maybe spending more money than you would on a normal meal on a Shabbat meal. Okay, moving on. Source number 3, we hear about some rabbis in the Talmud, their specific thoughts they had about someone who delights properly on Shabbat, what the reward is for that. Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, with regard to anyone who delights in the Shabbat, God gives him a boundless portion. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, one who delights in Shabbat is rescued from the oppression of exile. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, with regard to anyone who delights in the Shabbat, God grants him his heart's desires. So the rabbis here of the Talmud are suggesting blessings for someone who delights in Shabbat. I think this has to do with taking the opportunity to elevate ourselves and connect with our own divine souls, which allows us to connect to divine ideals and then enables us to live holier lives. Finding delight in Shabbat observance is just as important as avoiding some of the prohibitions. Together, they enable us to kind of spiritually recharge and to tune in. Let's move on. So source number 4. Oh, I skipped it. Source number 4, it is forbidden to fast until 6 hours on Shabbat. Ramah, and even for the purpose of learning or prayer, it is forbidden. So just to explain that, so when it says until 6 hours, that's halachic hours. So that means the day and night are divided into 12 halachic hours, and it varies based on how much daylight. But let's say if sun up to sundown was 7 to 7, for example, then it would actually be exactly 12. That would be mathematically work out easily. Then it would be, and you have to eat by 1 in order to not be doing something, a transgression of it would be like you're fasting on Shabbat if you waited too long to eat. But then conversely, some people who might be sick, unwell, might be more uncomfortable for them to eat. There's all kinds of things that could come up that make this not possible for someone. Some say that a person who is harmed by eating, such that is their delight not to eat, should not eat. Ramah, and so with one who finds delight in weeping, in order that their pain will leave their heart, such a person is permitted to weep on Shabbat. So really interesting. Not what we maybe would expect to see, especially that kind of that parallel there is interesting, or just bringing up that other example is very interesting. The idea that delight is subjective for the majority of people. Most people don't want to be fasting for extended periods of time. Most people enjoy food and drink. But if this is going to cause you more discomfort, that's going to take away from your delight, then this rule doesn't apply to you that we just said, that you have to eat by a certain time so as not to be fasting on Shabbat. So it's really subjective, that we're trying to make sure that every person really has an experience of this oneg, of delight on Shabbat. And we have to make contingencies for people that are maybe not with the majority of people who enjoy or who are able to comfortably eat. Okay, now a little bit about the idea of having 3 meals, which is unique to Shabbat. So the sages taught, this is from the Talmud in the tractate having to do with Shabbat, the sages taught in a Braita, how many meals is a person obligated to eat on Shabbat? 3. Rabbi Chidka says 4. Rabbi Yochanan said, and both of them derive their opinions from one verse. And Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is Shabbat for God. Today you will not find it in the field." So what does that mean? How do we derive it from that verse? Rashi explains, how do we get to 3 meals from this verse of the Torah? 3 todays, the number of the 3 meals of Shabbat. So 3 meals coming from the times that Hayom, today, is mentioned in that verse, having to do with eating on Shabbat, collecting the manna that the Israelites had to do in the desert in order to have food ready for them for Shabbat. They had to do on Erev Shabbat. So 3 meals in the time of the sages, so in the time of the rabbis, would be distinct from regular weekday. So in their time, it would be normal for someone to have 2 meals in a day. So on Shabbat, it has to be something special. And we also have this, it being derived from the verse in the Torah because of the repetitive language. So there's a practical reason that we want Shabbat to be special and to be more abundant and more enjoyable than a normal weekday. So in a society that has 2 meals, the rabbis instituted 3. And also because of this proof that they have from the text of the repetition of the language of today 3 times, having to do with this verse, having to do with gathering and eating of the food. Okay. Also having to do with the manna falling from the heavens, we get the idea of lechem mishnah, the idea of having 2 loaves of bread. I'm sure people have noticed that any Shabbos table you've been at for dinner or lunch, there's always 2 loaves of challah, at least. Some people have traditions to have more. There's all kinds of different Kabbalistic traditions to have. There's one to have 12, but 2 is the standard number, and that's the required number. You have to have 2 full loaves of bread of challah. They could be small, but they have to be complete, made that way to be that being the loaf, not something that's cut up or ripped up already, or imperfect, not fully the way it was baked. So let's read a little bit about that, some of the sources on that. We have the custom to, backtracking. This is more so about the bread in general. We'll get into a little bit more about the why it's double, but the first few sources are just about the bread in general and how we cover it as well. We have the custom to spread a covering and then make kiddush. And the explanation is a remembrance of the manna, and it wouldn't fall on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and there would be dew above and below the manna in between. So we talked about that the manna would fall, and they would take it on Erev Shabbat, and they would gather it for Shabbats because you were not allowed to gather on Shabbat, and because of this idea that we spoke about early on about hachana, about preparation as well. So they would be fully prepared and ready for Shabbat and able to enjoy Shabbat. So the manna would come in a double portion on Friday. They would collect it, and then when they collected it, the dew, the tal, would be on top and below, and we have a tray, and we put a challah cover over the challah as a remembrance of the tal that would be on the manna when the Jews would collect it in the desert. That's one opinion. That's one option as to how we explain our tradition of always covering the challah. Option number 2 comes in source 8. Our custom is to bring out the challahs before kiddush and to spread a covering and to make kiddush. And in the Jerusalem Talmud, it says that the challah won't be embarrassed, meaning since it is the first in the verse from the Torah and was fitting to come first in the blessings. So maybe people have heard this explanation before. So the challah shouldn't be embarrassed. What is that about, though? Is that the challah very modest and wants to be covered? It doesn't want to be naked? No, it's not about that. It's about the verse that mentions the 7 species of the land in Israel. It says a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey. So there are 7 species associated with the land of Israel that come from that verse from the Torah. And in this verse, it's understood that the order indicates the importance. So bread comes before wine. The wheat and barley precede the vines that are associated with the grapes for making wine. And similarly in our brachot, our order of brachot is that the from highest to lowest, we have hamotzi lechem min haaretz is the highest one, and then borei pri hagafen, the blessing on wine, and then we have other blessings, and then all the way at the bottom, so to speak, is shehal kol nihiyeh bivaro, the one that is the most general and can cover the most things. but is the last in the hierarchy of importance and preference. So that's the challah that should be first by all accounts. It's the most important blessing. It is the first in the verse that has to do with the species of the land of Israel. So by all accounts, the challah should be first. And what happens? We make kiddush first because we have to make this special sanctification of the day, and we do that on wine. So we cover the challah so that it doesn't have to see that it's not getting its fair turn, that we're giving preference to the wine so that we can sanctify the day, and not using the challah, which by all, it really should be first. So we have to, we don't want to hurt its feelings. We don't want to. So it's one of those two reasons. Those are the two reasons that have to do with why we cover it, because of the remembrance of the dew being above and below. When the Jews would collect the manna, there was always dew on the bread, and because of us wanting to be kindly to the challah. Okay, source number 9. Every person is obligated to break bread on 2 whole loaves. One holds them both in his hands and breaks the bottom one. Ramah specifically on the night of Shabbat. However, on Shabbat day or on the night of Yom Tov, we break the top one, and the reason is according to the Kabbalah. So there's different Kabbalistic reasons as to which one would go first. Some say that we have this principle as well as in ma'avirin al mitzvot, that we don't pass over a mitzvah. So actually, there'd be an idea that whichever challah you're going to break first should be a little bit closer to you, so that you're not passing over one mitzvah to get to another one. But the idea of which one actually goes first is a Kabbalistic idea, and there's different traditions on that. But I think the really important takeaway here is the obligation to have 2 full loaves, that we have to have a proper remembrance of the manna, and we also have to have this, it's also in the spirit of abundance and oneg of Shabbat. And that they should be held, both chalot should be held in the hands of the person making the blessing while they make the blessing. Is another important thing that we learned from that source. Okay, moving on, source number 10. 2 loaves. As a remembrance to the manna, as it is written, they gathered double the amount of bread, and also on Yom Tov, you need 2 loaves. And women are also obligated in the double portion of bread, because they too are part of the miracle of the manna. So the Israelites, gathered on Friday. We spoke about this before Shabbat, a double portion, so that they would be provided for on Shabbat. That's why we have this remembrance by having a double portion of challah at each Shabbat meal. I thought the source was interesting because it touches upon something that we've learned in a previous class that we had together. It's interesting that the Mishnah Berurah here is noting the reason why he says that women are also obligated in this double portion of bread. So I would have thought that it would be about the same thing we learned about Kiddush. So we learned about Kiddush, we said that positive commandments on Shabbat, because they're associated with the negative commandments, because Shamor and Zachor are very closely tied to one another, that even though the Mitzvot of Shabbat are time-bound, the positive commandments are still obligatory equally for men and women. But here he gives another reason. So that would have been a strong enough case on its own, but here he says because they were also part of the miracle, which I thought was interesting language, because that's the same kind of language that's used when we're talking about the mitzvot of Hanukkah and Purim. We said that both those miracles, when the Jewish people were saved, and specifically in the story of Purim, where one of the heroine was, we had a Jewish woman who was leading the movement, what saved the Jewish people. So it's kind of using that same justification of, we say, Af hen hayu be'oto hanes, that they too were that part of the miracle, and he's using that language here, even though we already had a very good halachic reason, but maybe it's just to invoke that idea that all of the Jewish people were a part of the miracle of the manna and were together in this experience of being in the desert and relying on God. And then the last 2 sources I want to look at, and then we can open up for questions. Just one source on each of 2 other just important details or little things that add to like the spirit and the themes that we're trying to invoke in our Shabbat meals. So one, I felt like I had to talk about the salt. The salt's very, very important that we always have the salt on the table, that you put it on the challah. So what does that come from? So the Ramah on the Shulchan Aruch, this is just the Ashkenazi voice there. He says, it is a mitzvah to place on every table salt before one slices the bread, because the table is comparable to the altar of the temple. and our food is like sacrifices. And it is said, with all of your offspring offerings, you must offer salt, and it is a protection from punishment. So, two things. Most importantly here is that we have this idea of Zecher LaMikdash, that we have, it's a remembrance of the temple. So possibly just in a very simple way, that in this joy and delight, kind of like what we do at the at a wedding, right before we break the glass and say Mazel Tov and sing and dance, we have that moment of Imesh Kachek, that we remember the temple. So there could be kind of like a parallel here with that we're always, even in our joyous moments, in our joyous Shabbos meal, we're bringing part of the temple and the remembrance of that, but also that we're actually like thinking of our space as a miniature allusion to the temple, that our table is like the mizbeach, like the altar, and that we should add salt to our food, that we add to the challah as like the salt was added to the offerings in the temple. So that very kind of like creating that visual, creating that real connection with that. And then the Ramah also adds, kind of in passing at the end, the idea of it being some kind of a good omen as well, for whatever reason, maybe also for mystical reasons. And then lastly, Zmirot, the songs that we sing at a Shabbat table. And then feast. After they have eaten all they desire, there are those who sing Zmirot and praise to God. And it is good to learn Torah slightly before eating. So singing and Torah study are also connected to Oneg Shabbat, as both are also part of elevating the soul, of being a recharge for our spiritual batteries. And I think I personally like the idea of how music is key to that, how music is a part of that. Maybe Torah would have been the more intuitive of the two, but also that music, that singing songs of Shabbat at the Shabbos table elevates that entire experience, and it's just an important part of how we as human beings experience joy.